السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا. وقال تعالى كم من فئة قليلة غلبت فئة كثيرة بإذن الله. Respected elders and brothers, first and foremost we have to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this great bounty of Iman which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in our hearts. This bounty of Iman is such that if we express our appreciation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the form of worship for our entire lives, then too it will not suffice in appreciation for this bounty. Because the person who enters last into paradise, the worst believer, the lowest believer in terms of status, who even had an iota of Iman in his heart, that person in the Akhirah, despite him having many weaknesses, could have been the worst of persons, no ibadah whatsoever. But he had one iota of Iman in his heart. One time in his life he said, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. After going through a cleansing period in hellfire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless that person with a Jannah which is 10 times the size of this world. A Jannah which is 10 times the size of this world. Now just reflect over that. Sometimes you see a mansion, 10 bedroom house, and we become awed by that. But the person who has the least Iman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so merciful, Allah will grant him a Jannah which is 10 times the size of this world. Subhanallah, this is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we can live our entire lives in sin. We can live our entire lives in disobedience. But the hope is so much that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants this type of person such a great Jannah. So imagine what is in store for us in the Akhirah. Now we know that the Muslim Ummah from time to time goes through different difficulties, different atrocities, different forms of oppression. And at the moment we know that our Muslim brothers and sisters in Palestine, they are going through a great test. They are going through great trials and tribulations, and literally if you have to see what is going on there, one cannot even look at the images, the videos, the ground situation that is happening there. It brings tears to one's eyes. It breaks the heart of a believer. And Masjid-ud-Duha is a place which is very sacred to the believer. We know that the first house on this earth was the Kaaba, the Baytullah, the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And 40 years later, Masjid-ud-Duha was established. And Masjid-ud-Duha has always had a significant attachment throughout all the Anbiya, throughout all the different prophets which have visited this world, and even Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. We know the Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, the ascension to the heavens, this happened from Masjid-ud-Duha. We know Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam that he performed salah, he led all the Anbiya in salah in Masjid-ud-Duha. And it comes in one hadith, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu says that Masjid-ud-Duha was built by the Anbiya, and the residents of Masjid-ud-Duha were the Anbiya as well. The prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were the residents of Masjid-ud-Duha. And there is not a single Nabi who did not perform his salah in Masjid-ud-Duha. And there is not a single handspan in Masjid-ud-Duha in the land of Palestine where an angel did not stand on that spot. So this is mentioned by Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. So Masjid-ud-Duha is an extremely holy site as a believer, and it comes in a hadith that this is the third holiest site after Makkah-ul Mukarramah, Masjid-ud-Nabawi. Masjid-ud-Duha is the third holiest site, and we know that the Jews claim that they have more right to Masjid-ud-Duha than the Muslims because their Anbiya came from this land, which is very untrue. Because over periods of time, the Jews they adulterated their religion, they changed their religion, they stopped following that which their Nabis brought, they changed whatever Masjid-ud-Duha was established for the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They erected this temple there, and the temple cult, which they then started introducing into their deen, and this is not the way which was even brought by their Anbiya. That is why when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam came, Rasulullah on the journey of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was brought to Masjid-ud-Duha to show the importance of Masjid-ud-Duha. And when he was asked by Jibreel alayhi salam that do you know all these people who are waiting for you to lead them in salah? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam replied in the negative, Jibreel alayhi salam told him that these are the Anbiya. These are every single Nabi which has come from the time of Adam alayhi salam till you, O Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, they are present here and you are going to read them in Salah. That inna deena inda Allah al-Islam. The religion which is accepted in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is Islam. So after the coming of the deen of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the rightful heirs to Masjid-ud Aqsa are the followers of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Because Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam purified Masjid-ud Aqsa from its idol worship. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam purified Masjid-ud Aqsa from all forms of worship which were contrary to that which the so-called followers of Musa alayhi salam started introducing. And the so-called followers of Isa alayhi salam knew new things which they started introducing. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam purified the holy lands of Masjid-ul Aqsa from this. So as believers, we have a strong attachment to Masjid-ul Aqsa. And Masjid-ul Aqsa has a strong attachment to our hearts. And what goes on in Masjid-ul Aqsa, this definitely affects a true believer. When a believer sees the Muslims of Masjid-ul Aqsa, the people in the precincts of Masjid-ul Aqsa, the Muslims of Palestine going through difficulties, this must affect us as believers. If we as believers are not becoming affected by what is happening there, by what is happening to our Palestinian brothers and sisters, then this is a cause for concern. Then our iman is in question. That what type of belief do we have that if our brothers are going through such great difficulties, such atrocities, that we have no feeling for that. We have no feeling for that. We just do not care. We are still selfish. We are still worried of our own lives. And we do not have this feeling and this difficulty going in our hearts that what is happening to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. Now in everything that happens in this world, there are lessons to be learned from, and our own personal reformation gets done. There are lessons to be learned from it, and our own personal reformations gets done. Now if you look at the situation that is going through in Masjid-ul Aqsa in Palestine, there are certain lessons that we have to learn as Muslims, that if we look to the West to solve our solutions, then this is never going to happen. If we look to the West to solve our solutions, if we look to the West, to the UN, etc., to solve the solutions that our brothers and sisters are going through under the Jews, this is going through looking into the UN, going from the Jews into a democratic system. And that is not the system of Islam. So it's going from one trap into another trap. So this should never be the solution of a believer. The solution of a believer should be that how can I fulfill the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How can I be obedient to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and thereby attract the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Thereby attract the nusrah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know that so many years we've been hearing that the Muslims of Palestine are going through so much atrocities, how much difficulties we have every 3 or 4 years, or every year in fact. There's a bombardment in Gaza, there's an all-out attack on Gaza, the lands, the buildings, the lives of innocent people are being taken. But what is the rest of the world doing about it? Despite knowing that so many people are being killed, so many old people are being killed, so many children are being killed, so many houses are being destroyed, so many mosques are being destroyed, the rest of the world, are they doing anything about it? No, they are not doing anything about it. It's been 30, 40, 50 years where we know that our brothers and sisters in Palestine are going through all these difficulties. Yet we still see signs, and we still see the countries of this world standing with Israel, the countries of this world standing with the Jews. So we must never have this hope that the rest of the world will be there to solve and be the solution of the Muslims. This will never happen. The solution of the Muslim and the plight of the Muslim Ummah and its solution lies in our hands ourselves. That when we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we start correcting our amal, when we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we fix up our own selves, this is when the situation in Masjid-ul Aqsa will change. Now, if we look at the land of Makkah al-Mukarramah and we look at the lands of Madinatul Munawwara, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself has taken the responsibility of protecting these lands. That is why when Abraha came with his army and he tried to destroy the Kaaba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the birds who pelted stones at them, and the entire army was supposed to be destroyed. But Masjid-ul Aqsa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is such that He has left it on the a'mal and the actions of the ummah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not Himself taken the responsibility that He will protect Masjid-ul Aqsa. In fact, in Surah Bani Israel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, and in tafsir of these verses, and the hadith which is mentioned, that a time will come when Masjid-ul Aqsa, when Palestine, will be taken away from the Muslims. Palestine will be taken away from the Muslims, and this will come into the hands of the Jews. And the Jews will become, they will become in the inhabitants of this land. So Masjid-ul-Aqsa, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهِ. They plan, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a master plan. So no matter what happens, the reality is, and the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam states, that Masjid-ul-Aqsa, the land of Palestine, will become a safe haven for the Jews. Will become a safe haven for the Jews. So it will be taken out of the control of the Muslims. Not to say that we mustn't be worried about it and we must do nothing about it. We have to stand, we have to try and do everything about it. We have to try and give our lives, we have to try and support them financially, we have to make lots of dua for them. But Masjid-ul-Aqsa at the end, it's in the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, will end up with the Jews. And this is not for us to become concerned and for us to become grieved. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you have to look at the hadith which is mentioned on the fitan, and what will happen towards the end of time, it mentions that the Jews will be gathered in Masjid-ul-Aqsa. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually made certain things easy for us. He has not given us any difficulty. We as Muslims do not have to go to certain countries to invite the Jews to all come to Palestine, to all come to the Holy Lands and now reside there. How difficult would that have been for us? Because this is a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Allah will make it so safe for them. Allah will grant them this land, and then after that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make this very land an abattoir for them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's mentioned in the hadith that the Jews will come and they will reside in Masjid al-Aqsa. They will take, in Palestine, they will take over these lands. And they will live there very safely, to such an extent that majority of the Jews from around the world, they themselves will come without any invitation to the lands of Palestine. And when they come to these lands, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause His army, the Muslim army, to gain power. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause the Muslim army to gain strength. And when this Muslim army gains strength, this is when the final battle will be held. That is why it is mentioned in a hadith that Ardul Mahshar wal Manshar, that Palestine, Syria, these type of lands where these wars are happening, these are lands which is the lands of gathering. The lands of gathering, and it's the lands of resurrection. The final war will happen on these lands. So these people will be gathered there. In the final war, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send His army there. And this is the time when the tree will speak, that a Jew is behind me. This is the time when a rock will speak, that a Jew is standing behind me. And ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant the Muslim army victory in that time, at that time. So it's not for us to become very concerned and aggrieved. But what do we do as believers that we can do in our own lives, which will affect our brothers and sisters? We must realize that the atrocity and the difficulties that the people of Palestine are going through is because of me and you. It is because of our actions. It's because of us going away from the obedience of the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, leaving the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That is why our brothers and sisters in Palestine and all the different parts of the world are suffering. This is the system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mentioned in many verses of the Quran al-Kareem. وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُمْ وَيَعْفُو عَن كَثِيرٍ. That whatever difficulty befalls this ummah, it is because of what the ummah earns with his own hands. It is not because of someone else. It is not because of some other ministers, or it's not because of some leaders, but it is because of our own amal. It is because of our own actions. ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ. That fasad, anarchy, will spread on this earth, بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ, because of that which we have earned with our own hands. Our own amal have become so depleted that the enemies are now being given power over us. And mentioned in many hadith that when we leave the action of Amr bil Ma'ruf, enjoining towards good, and we leave this action of Nahi anil Munkar, it's stopping from evil. And this has to do with every sort of good that is encouraged by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is with regards to stopping every evil which Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that is evil. If this ummah leaves that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place tyrant and oppressive rulers over us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place tyrant and oppressive rulers over us. So our actions, mine and your actions, respected elders and brothers, in South Africa, sitting in this masjid, have a direct impact on the atrocities and the difficulties that the ummah is suffering wherever they may be. Whether it is Palestine, whether it's Syria, whether it is in whichever country. The solution is that we have to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to make sincere dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many a time, we think that solution is in outward actions. We think that solutions are in outward actions. That okay, now we must have a boycott of all Jewish products. I'm not saying we mustn't do that, but we think that that is the solution. And we think that no, now we have to have a big march in the streets, we have to hold placards, and we have to go out and we have to march in support of Palestine. That's on its place. But this is not the solution. If you are going to these places and you are breaking the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then will Allah's rahmah come or will Allah's wrath come? We have to ask ourselves those questions. If you are going to these places where our women are parading openly and where there are contraventions of Sharia, then Allah's mercy can never come. Allah's mercy is in the obedience of the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the solution really is in dua. That this is the most powerful weapon that we have. If boycotting was so important, we must ask ourselves this. That is why it is very important for us to study history, to study the history of Islam. Look at the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had business dealings with the Jews. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had business dealings with the Jews. Until his very moment of his death, he had business dealings with the Jews. Now if nusra, if help was going to be because we must cut off business dealings with the Jews, the help of Allah would come, wouldn't Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam have adopted that? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he passed away, he had a armor to cover his body in battlefield. He had that which was on mortgage from the Jews. It was on loan from the Jews. His inheritors had to go out and pay this Jew the money which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam owed to him. So until his very death and even after his death, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had business dealings with the Jews. So this is not a means of us getting the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, we think that we will cripple the economy, we will do this, we will do that. That is all in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have no control over that. But what is in our control is that we sort out our lives. And that we learn from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That when even kam min fi'atin qalilatin ghalabat fi'atan kathiratan bi'idhnillah. That how many, a little group, a small group of believers, when they brought taqwa in their lives, when they turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when they became obedient in the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ghalabat fi'atan kathira. They overpowered many large armies. Just a few days ago in this very mosque, we did the tafsir of how the army of Jalut was destroyed by Talut and Dawood alayhi salam. That an army of 40,000 set out to Talut. And only 313 ended up going with him in the battle. But they destroyed a great army. Why? Because they passed the test, they fulfilled the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at the battle of Badr. 313 defeats 1,000. Why? Those 313, they had taqwa, they had belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we must adopt those means which are in our control. And that is fixing up our amal, fixing up our actions. If these things which are happening throughout the world, in Palestine and in all the different countries, are not alarm bells for us to fix up our own amal, then when are we going to wake up as an ummah? So these things, we need to take lessons from these things which are happening in Gaza. Our Palestinian brothers and sisters and children who are giving their lives, they have attained the rank of martyrdom. They are going to be elevated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And from the inception, Muslims have given bodies. Muslims have given blood in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we must understand, a child once said to me the other day, that, Moulana, we want the Palestinians to win. We want the Palestinians to win. And this is the way a child understands it. So you have to sit with a child and explain to him that in battle in Islam, in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, winning and losing is not the sign of acceptance. Winning and losing is not the sign of acceptance. An army of Muslims can lose, but they can be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like how the battle of Uhud, outwardly the Muslims lost, but they were accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So winning and losing isn't the sign of acceptance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The sign of acceptance is putting our lives in accordance to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Putting our lives in accordance to the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So really what is happening in Palestine, we do not know. We do not know what is happening in Palestine. Yes, we are getting news which is coming from here, news which is coming from there. But the reality of what is happening on the ground, we do not know. We know Muslim people, we know something is happening. We know innocent people are losing their lives. Who's involved? What is happening? What is conspiracy theories? None of us know that. That alimun bidhat sudur knows. That only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself knows what's the plan. But what is in mine and your control is to fix up our lives. And this is the lesson that we need to take. That we need to make lots of dua for our Muslims, brothers and sisters who are suffering throughout the world. Waking up at the time of tahajjud, shedding tears, making dua for our Muslim brothers and sisters wherever they may be that are suffering. This is what will cause change. We have such a weapon in our hands which can change anything besides death, and that is dua. So we need to really wake up at the time of tahajjud salah. Wake up 1 hour earlier than the time of fajr. Turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Cry before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves to see. That dua can change any condition. The condition of the world is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not in the hands of anybody else. And if we turn to that Allah who is controlling the world, we all make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will change the condition. Bring our lives in accordance to the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let us choose salah over sleep. Let us choose the lifestyle of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam over fashion. Let us choose pure business dealings instead of dealing in interest, instead of having overdraft facilities, where that is waging war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It comes in hadith that two things a person wages war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One is he troubles a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a person troubles another person who is a friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala personally takes it upon him to wage war against that person. So who can be saved from that? And when a person is involved in interest, then a person is waging war against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So who can be saved from that? So we need to change our own lives. Make sure everything in our lives is according to Sharia. A Muslim businessman was saying that he has lots of dealings with a very big Jewish person. This person owns many cash and carries throughout the country. He was saying that once he got into conversation with this Jewish supplier on the situation in Palestine, on what is happening in Palestine. So the Jewish person is telling the Muslim businessman that us Jews, we are not worried of the Muslims until they do not fill their masjids for Fajr Salah. The Jewish person is saying this. He's telling the Muslim businessman that we are not worried that the Muslims can do whatever they want. They can take whatever they want. But the real day when we are worrying is when we see the Muslims filling the masjids for Fajr Salah. That's the time we will realize that the Muslim Ummah has now woken up. So this they are saying that we need to, as Muslims, fix up our own Salah. That we need to ensure that we as Baligh males in our areas, that we read our 5 daily Salah in the masjid. This will attract the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Make a lot of dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Dua really is the solution to all our problems. See that our dealings are correct. See that our business dealings are correct. Our dealings with our wives, our children, our family matters. See all those type of things are in order. Come to the masjid for salah. Do the actions which please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This attracts the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then also to discharge charity. So we know we are sitting here, we cannot go and help those people who are suffering, but yes, we can give them. We can give them in a monetary means. People who give charity in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this cools the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's anger gets cooled by a person who discharges charity in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So very important for us, respected elders and brothers, to understand that whatever difficulty that we are going through, whatever difficulty our brothers and sisters are going through, we sympathize with, for them. We cry for them. We turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We make that extra effort to make dua for them. Wake up at the time of Tahajjud Salah. Make dua for our Muslim brothers and sisters. Make dua for ourselves. Daily after our Farad Salah. Lift our hands. Make dua for them. Collectively as a family, make dua for our Muslim brothers and sisters. Then make sure that our a'mal, that our actions which are incorrect, we may have weaknesses. Every single one of us has weaknesses. But turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. Fix up our actions. Draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And let us draw lessons before it is too late. The entire world at the moment is on a time bomb. The entire world, situations throughout the world are changing minute by minute. If we do not wake up now, our lives can change in minutes. Our lives can change in seconds. Our lives can change over a few amount of days. Let us wake up. Let us turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let us take lesson from what is happening throughout the world so that we can become better Muslims. We can become better believers. We fix our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, thereby attracting the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and really lots of dua at this time. We cannot overemphasize the amount of dua that is needed for the ummah. And this is what will bring solutions for the ummah. This is what will bring the mercy of Allah. Allah loves when we turn to Him. We shed tears in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why one hadith comes that a person will sin and he will make dua for forgiveness. He will shed a tear. Allah loves that. And he will sin again. It will be a major sin. He will turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will shed tears again. He will cry for forgiveness. Allah loves that. Allah will keep on making him getting involved in that sin and asking for forgiveness. That is why hadith mentions that if this ummah, they know people who ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring sinners in this ummah who will ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness continuously. So turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ensure our salah is in order, ensure our dealings are in order, and inshallah this will attract the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and change the conditions throughout the world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the pain that our Muslim brothers and sisters are going through. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them respite. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless them with help from His side. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take care of those young innocent children who have been left without parents. children whose homes have been destroyed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take care of them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it such that in whatever way we can assist, we should assist inshallah. Subhanallah wa hamdi, subhanallah al-azim. Nash'alu la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.